nearly choked on my coffee this morning when I saw fresh concrete poured all over my backyard. My neighbors? They claim it's a new playground for the kids. Approved by the HOA, of course, but guess what? It's my private property. Would you stand up to them or let it slide? Comment below where you're watching from, and let's dive into how I confronted HOA Karen and her unstoppable thirst for control. I spent the rest of that morning fuming about the sudden invasion of my backyard. The sight of that rough, hastily poured concrete was enough to make me pace in anger. My wife tried to calm me down, gently suggesting we wait to see if it was simply some misunderstanding, but I could feel the pulse of injustice surging. How could anyone be so brazen as to dump concrete onto private property without first asking permission? Still, I had to work. My boss needed me on a remote conference call by 9, and I tried my best to focus on spreadsheets rather than my backyard-turned eyesore. But every time I glanced out the window, that new slab glared back at me. Inside my own house, I started to feel a sense of helplessness. Was I expected to tear it out myself? Or should I call the police, the city, a lawyer? The idea of confronting Karen directly bubbled up in my mind. After all, she was the HOA representative who had apparently given this project her seal of approval. My wife Meredith worried that a confrontation would spark a bigger conflict. We were still relatively new to the neighborhood. The last thing we needed was to create friction. But I couldn't just ignore a cement slab that wasn't supposed to be there. At noon, I decided to get some fresh air and maybe talk things out with my neighbors. On the surface, they seemed like ordinary folks, retirees who watered their lawns at dawn, young couples who jogged in matching outfits, families that spent weekends barbecuing together. But the presence of Karen loomed over every friendly wave. If she was truly behind this unauthorized construction, I knew I'd be in for a challenge. I took a short walk down the block, intending to knock on a few doors and gather any intel I could. First stop, a tidy gray bungalow owned by an older gentleman named Graham. He'd lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, I'd heard. If anyone had perspective on how the HOA operated, it would be him. Graham was out front trimming his hedges when he noticed me approach. "Morning," he said, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. "You look like you've got something on your mind." I explained the situation, waking up to find newly poured concrete stretching across a portion of my yard, and an HOA note pinned on a stake claiming it was part of a grand plan to provide a playground for the kids. Graham pursed his lips and exhaled slowly. "That woman's at it again," he sighed. "Karen's done stunts like this before, though never quite so intrusive. She tried to force me to repaint my house last spring because she said the color was too dull, claimed it brought down property values. My wife and I nearly lost it." "Did you fight her on it?" "Sure did, but every time we tried to push back, she'd wave around some bylaw or gather enough votes from the board to side with her. She's crafty, I'll give her that." He pointed to a house at the end of the block. "If you really want to know Karen's track record, you might consider talking to John. He's a former HOA board member, one of the originals, actually. He stepped down about a year ago. Rumor says it was because of Karen's methods." I thanked Graham and walked on, my curiosity piqued. If John was once part of the HOA, then he had inside knowledge. Maybe he could confirm if this playground had been approved by the full board, or if it was just Karen's personal project disguised as official business. John's place was at a corner lot, a modest single-story home with a wide porch. Hanging ferns dotted the overhang and wind chimes clinked in the gentle breeze. I rang the doorbell, nerves thrumming in my chest. The door opened, revealing a man in his late 50s. He wore a casual polo shirt and carried a welcoming, albeit slightly wary, expression. "Hi," I began, introducing myself. "I live a few houses down, and I heard you used to be on the HOA board. Something strange happened this morning that I think you might be able to help clarify." I outlined the scenario, the concrete Karen, and my utter confusion. John listened carefully, nodding in places, wincing in others, until I finished the story. Sounds about right, he said, crossing his arms. That's typical Karen, always pushing her own plans without proper authorization. The board members were tired of it, but somehow she still finds ways to manipulate our bylaws. So this playground, was it actually approved by the HOA? I asked. John huffed. Highly doubtful. She might have coerced a few people to sign off or used some outdated clause, but the formal process requires notification, votes, permits, especially for construction on private property. Nobody in their right mind would endorse dumping concrete in your yard without first clearing it with you. I felt a mix of relief and renewed agitation. Then she's operating without real backing? Most likely, John answered. I saw her do something similar a few months back, trying to install benches near someone's flower garden. The property owner threatened legal action, and she backed off. But this time, I said, glancing toward the direction of my house, she's gotten as far as physically pouring concrete. That's no small oversight. John nodded in agreement. She's escalating, likely trying to make a name for herself, or maybe she's campaigning to become the official head of the board. She does that by showing off community improvements. Problem is, she doesn't think about property rights or the actual rules. She figures people will just roll over and accept it. My frustration flared. I'm not rolling over, I'm considering my options. Legal recourse may be. But I'm new here, and I'm not exactly looking to wage a war against the entire HOA. You'll need proof, he cautioned. Document everything, take pictures, videos, get estimates on how much it would cost to remove the concrete. Make sure you have a record of property lines. Karen might claim your backyard is part of some communal green space. The mention of communal green space rang a bell. I did recall something in the homeowner documents about certain easements or shared spaces, but my yard was definitely not part of that. I thanked John and headed back home, my head buzzing with possibilities. Meredith greeted me at the door with a concerned look. Did you find out anything? Plenty, I replied, explaining what John had said. This is definitely not official. She's acting on her own. But we have to be careful. She's manipulative and might try to claim some bylaw that supports her so-called project. She already stuck a sign up that says, HOA approved, Meredith said, rolling her eyes. It's obnoxious, like she's mocking us. We sat down at the kitchen table, a pile of paperwork in front of us, the deed to the house, the HOA guidelines, any notes we'd taken when we first moved in. Going through everything line by line was tedious, but I was determined. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one, but under the proper rules and guidelines. I refused to let her walk all over me. In the midst of this, my phone buzzed. I checked the screen to see a text from a neighbor, Lisa, who lived a few doors down. We weren't close friends, more like cordial acquaintances, but she'd gotten my number during a community garage sale. Her message read, Hey, I noticed the construction in your backyard. Are you okay with that? Or is it another one of Karen's stunts? I appreciated the solidarity. At least some neighbors recognized this was not normal. I told Lisa that I was definitely not okay with it and was looking into ways to have it removed. She replied with a sympathetic note. She's a menace. Keep me posted if you need any witness statements or anything. My husband saw the workers show up around 5 a.m. Armed with new evidence, a potential eyewitness to the clandestine pouring, I felt a surge of energy. I took pictures of the concrete from every angle, capturing the sign that read, Playground for Neighborhood Kids, HOA approved, in bright spray-painted letters. The sign itself looked amateurish, done in a rush. Possibly the work crew tried to label the site so that no one would question it during construction. That evening, Meredith and I pored over more documents. We found explicit mention of property lines that extended a clear boundary around our yard. No mention of communal usage. We also found mention of the protocol for new projects funded by the HOA. They required at least a month's notice, a discussion in the monthly board meeting, and a majority vote. Additionally, any major construction had to be greenlit with official city permits if it was beyond certain dimensions. This so-called playground fell under all those stipulations, meaning Karen should have had a stack of paperwork to justify even a single cement bag in my yard. Meredith looked up from the pages. So, what's the plan? Are we filing a complaint with the city? Calling a lawyer? I took a breath, remembering John's advice about being thorough. Yes, eventually, but first I want to see how Karen reacts when I confront her with the facts. If she refuses to correct the situation, we'll escalate. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I replayed possible scenarios in my head. Maybe I'd walk up to Karen's house, knock on her door, and present the documents politely. She might laugh in my face or threaten me with some obscure rule. Or maybe she'd realize she was in over her head and back off. But given everything I'd heard about Karen, the second option seemed unlikely. I woke up early the next morning, determined to confront her. Armed with a folder of evidence and an iPad loaded with relevant screenshots, I walked out the front door. That was when I realized something new had appeared on our lawn overnight. A second sign, reading, "Commencing tomorrow, construction all kids welcome to use facility." My eyes practically bulged. She was doubling down. Meredith followed me outside, gasping at the sign. She's not going to wait? She's actually going to move forward with this? This is insane, I muttered, feeling my blood pressure spike. She must think we'll just accept it if enough people show up to use it. I decided to march straight to Karen's place. Her house was only a couple of streets away, known for its immaculately trimmed hedges and a comically large HOA pride plaque. I rapped on her door, adrenaline pushing away any second thoughts. Karen opened it with a bright, almost artificial smile. She wore a blouse in a shade of glaring pink, offset by a massive HOA badge pinned to her collar. "Oh, hello there. To what do I owe the pleasure?" I forced a civil tone. "I'm here about that concrete slab you poured in my backyard. We have some problems." She raised an eyebrow, still smiling. "Problems? I heard everyone was thrilled about the new playground." "I've had a few neighbors thank me, actually." I doubted that, but didn't want to get sidetracked. "Right, well, according to the official guidelines, you need a majority board vote, city permits for construction over a certain size, and explicit permission from the homeowner, me, if it's on private property, none of which you have." Karun's smile tightened. "My dear, the HOA has broad authority when it comes to community improvements. Your yard is, in some sense, part of the neighborhood's overall aesthetic. We're simply enhancing it." I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. "That's not how property rights work. I have documentation that proves I own that space outright. Now, if you have a legitimate permit or formal approval, please show it to me." She shrugged, taking a step back as if to end the conversation. "The board gave me verbal approval at our last informal meeting. Paperwork is on its way." "An informal meeting? That's not recognized by the bylaws," I countered. "You need a scheduled session with minutes, a quorum present, and an official vote. That's what your own rules say. Do you have any record of that?" Her eyes flickered for just a moment, betraying a shred of uncertainty. "I don't have them on me, but don't worry, it's all legit. Why don't you come back later?" I refused to budge. "Karen, I'm requesting formally that you remove the concrete. Otherwise, I'll have to involve the city and you'll be held responsible for trespassing and damage to private property." Her mouth twitched into a sour expression. "I think you'll find that I have plenty of support in this community. But sure, go ahead, do what you must." She shut the door before I could reply. I stared at the polished wood for a moment, anger swirling in my chest. Clearly, she wasn't going to do the decent thing. This was now officially a bigger problem than I'd hoped. Returning home, I relayed the conversation to Meredith, who wore a worried frown. She's not even pretending to have real documents. Apparently, it's all verbal approval. She might be banking on people being too scared or disorganized to challenge her. Is that enough to get the city to step in? I shrugged. The city requires permits for any permanent structure. This is definitely permanent. I'll file a complaint, but it might take time for them to investigate. That afternoon, I compiled a folder of everything: photos, statements, the texts from Lisa, the deed showing my property lines. Then I wrote an email to the local code enforcement office, detailing how my backyard was commandeered by an unauthorized project. It felt cathartic clicking send, but also a little nerve-wracking. I'd lived in bigger cities where bureaucracy could move like molasses, and I wasn't sure how efficient this town's government was. Time crawled by over the next few days. Each morning I checked the yard, half expecting more changes. None came. The concrete remained, the sign still proclaiming it a soon-to-open playground. The tension lingered, a tight knot in my stomach that wouldn't unravel. I kept in touch with John, who provided moral support. Don't let her intimidate you. The city will have your back once they see your evidence. One evening, Meredith and I decided to call a neighborhood friend over for dinner. Greg, a father of 3 who lived just a block away. If anyone had an interest in playgrounds, it would be him. But when he showed up, he looked uneasy. "Karen cornered me the other day," he explained, setting down a bottle of wine he'd brought. "She was talking about how this new kid zone is going to be a game changer for families here. She even hinted that I should voice my support if it comes to a vote." I asked him directly, "So are you supporting this?" He shook his head. "No way. I like the idea of a playground, sure, but not in someone else's backyard without their approval. That's just messed up." I told her it sounded like she was overstepping, and she gave me this cold stare. "Let's keep the community spirit alive," she said, in that ominous tone of hers. It sounded exactly like Karen. She had no qualms about manipulating people or guilt-tripping them into taking her side. Greg confirmed she'd been going door to door touting her improvement plan. Some neighbors, especially those with kids, were intrigued by the idea of a free place to play. Others, particularly retirees, were indifferent or didn't want to get caught in the drama. Karen likely saw me as the lone dissenter, an obstacle to her bigger ambitions. Days turned into a week. I finally heard back from the code enforcement office via email. They explained they'd received my complaint and would be scheduling an inspection. They requested additional documents, which I sent right away. That was progress. At least something was moving forward in the official channels. Meanwhile, I noticed Karen's drive to rally support intensifying. Tiny flyers began appearing in mailboxes throughout the neighborhood, announcing a family-friendly unveiling of the new playground. The date was set for the coming Saturday. My name wasn't mentioned, but I could tell it was meant to pressure me. If half the neighborhood showed up with their kids, would I have the nerve to demand they leave? John called me one afternoon. "Saw the flyer. She's definitely going all in. She's basically throwing a block party around this monstrosity in my yard," I said, exasperated. "Do I just politely ask them all to go away?" John sighed. "You might want to talk to a lawyer before Saturday. Karen's showmanship can create a false sense of legitimacy. If families and kids show up, it complicates your position. People might see you as the bad guy for spoiling their fun." "But it's my backyard," I nearly shouted. "Why can't people see that?" "Because Karen's spinning it as a community service. She's good at marketing illusions." I ran a hand through my hair, frustration mounting. "I'm not going to let her turn this into a circus. The city inspector hasn't even come by yet." John suggested I write a formal cease and desist letter, citing specific bylaws, and deliver it to Karen and the HOA board. He said it might serve as notice that if they proceed, they're risking legal consequences. That evening I drafted the letter, referencing the exact paragraphs from the homeowner documents that required official approval and property owner consent. Meredith reviewed it, adjusting the language to sound firm but not overly hostile. By nightfall, I fired off the email to the HOA board's general address and printed a physical copy to slip under Karen's door. I doubted it would deter her, but at least I'd have proof that I'd tried to resolve the matter calmly and within the rules. Then, as the deadline for her unveiling approached, I braced myself. I expected her to either back down or ramp up her efforts. Deep down, I knew which was more likely. Saturday morning arrived with brilliant sunshine and a gentle breeze, the sort of weather that practically begged for a barbecue or a neighborhood picnic. It was also the day Karen had chosen for her big playground unveiling. I woke up feeling an uneasy mix of dread and determination. By 8 o'clock, I heard voices outside. Peering through the blinds, I saw Karen, dressed in a bright sundress, chatting with a small group of neighbors at the edge of my backyard. They were gesturing to the concrete slab and nodding politely, as if discussing interior decor. I stifled an urge to fling the door open and shout, "Get off my property!" But I knew I needed to handle this with a clear head. Meredith and I readied ourselves. We'd called the non-emergency police line the previous day, letting them know a dispute was brewing. They said to call if any trespassing or disturbances occurred. I wanted to avoid making a scene that involved law enforcement, but Karen was basically orchestrating a showdown on my turf. Around 9, more people arrived. Families with strollers, kids on bikes. They clustered around the perimeter of my backyard. Some folks looked bewildered, others appeared mildly curious. I recognized Greg, who gave me a sympathetic shrug from across the fence. He mouthed, "Sorry," as if to say he was powerless to stop this bizarre gathering. Then Karen stepped into the center of my yard, a wide grin on her face. She waved her arms enthusiastically as if she were a tour guide. I could just make out her voice as she started extolling the virtues of the new community playground. A pang of outrage jolted through me. I was about to storm outside when Meredith placed a hand on my arm. "Wait," she said softly. "Let her dig herself deeper. We have everything documented. Once the inspector comes, or if the police get involved, she can't claim ignorance. She's blatantly trespassing in front of witnesses now." I gave a reluctant nod. My phone was in hand, camera app open. I recorded the scene through the window, capturing Karen's speech. She was telling people about how the HOA was forward-thinking and that they wanted to put the community first. This in my own backyard, without my permission? The nerve. Suddenly, a loud bark drew everyone's attention. 2 dogs charged in from somewhere, chasing each other across the slab of concrete. Their owner, a flustered woman, darted after them, apologizing profusely. The dogs left paw prints in a drying patch of paint Karen had used to mark hopscotch lines. Karen's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly plastered on another grin, welcoming the furry neighbors. My resolve snapped. I marched outside, phone still in hand. "Karen," I called, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We need to talk." She turned, face beaming like she'd just spotted a beloved relative. "There you are. Come join us. We're celebrating your big backyard upgrade." My patience was gone. "Everyone, I'd like to clarify something important." I raised my voice to address the crowd. "This is my private property. I have not given permission for this so-called playground. Karen has no permit, no official HOA vote, and no city approval to be here. You are all trespassing." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Some parents ushered their children away from the concrete slab. A few neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Karen's face reddened, her veneer of sweetness cracking slightly. She tried to laugh it off. "Don't be silly. The HOA guidelines state—" "I have the guidelines right here," I interrupted, tapping a folder under my arm. "And they clearly say any structure, especially one that's permanent, needs not only a majority vote but also city permits when on private property. I do not approve. The city inspector will confirm that." Karen's composure wavered. "Surely you can't be that opposed to giving the kids some place to play? It's for the neighborhood's benefit. Don't you want to be a good neighbor?" A few people in the crowd cast disapproving looks my way, but I stood firm. "I'm all for community improvements when they're done legally and with respect for property rights. This is neither." Someone in the crowd muttered, "I didn't realize it was privately owned." Another whispered Karen said it was a shared easement. The confusion spread. Karen shot me a glare, recognizing her narrative was unraveling. "All right," she finally said, her voice shaking with an edge of anger. if that's how you want to play it. This is a sad day for the children, but I won't force anyone to use it if you're going to be so unreasonable." With that, she turned on her heel and addressed the gathering. "The event is over, folks. Sorry for the inconvenience, but apparently not everyone appreciates progress." Some parents quickly guided their kids away, clearly uncomfortable. Others lingered, perhaps feeling misled. Greg gave me a thumbs up from a distance. It wasn't a scene I'd ever imagined for a Saturday morning, but here we were. Karen left in a flurry of indignation, heading down the sidewalk. A handful of watchers followed, murmuring questions about why the HOA had claimed this was authorized in the first place. A strange hush fell over the backyard once they were gone. It felt oddly anticlimactic, like I'd braced for a tornado but only got heavy rain. I took another video documenting the aftermath. Empty cups and stray balloons littered the edges of the slab, evidence of Karen's attempt at a neighborhood spectacle. Meredith approached, her face awash in relief and concern. "You okay?" she asked gently. "Yeah," I breathed, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. "I think so. She's furious, but at least she's gone, for now." Back inside, I received a call from code enforcement. The inspector said he'd be available to come out on Monday morning. Perfect timing, I thought. I texted John an update telling him Karen's event had fizzled. He replied with a celebratory emoji and a caution. "Don't let your guard down. She'll regroup." Sure enough, by Sunday evening, Karen's comeback arrived, in the form of an HOA meeting notice slipped under my door. The paper read, "Emergency session, topic, community playground and potential violations, scheduled for Tuesday night at the local community center." The agenda seemed to revolve around my backyard. "Great," Meredith said dryly. "We're the talk of the neighborhood now." I tried to remain optimistic. If the board members follow their own rules, they'll have to acknowledge Karen overstepped. Let's see what they do. But a knot formed in my stomach. HOA politics could be messy. Some folks might side with Karen just to avoid her wrath or because they believed her spin. I needed to be ready. Monday morning came and the city inspector arrived bright and early. He was a middle-aged man with a clipboard and a no-nonsense attitude. I walked him through the yard, explaining how I'd discovered the concrete and how Karen claimed it was HOA approved. The inspector peered at the slab, took measurements, and snapped photos. He asked a few pointed questions about who authorized it and whether I'd ever signed any document. I provided all the evidence I had. He took his notes, frowned, and said, "Yeah, this looks like a violation of multiple ordinances. No permit was filed, no homeowner permission. I'll file my report. If the HOA can't provide valid documentation, they're in trouble." Hearing that lifted a weight off my chest. I thanked him, then watched him drive off to presumably pen his official findings. This was exactly what I needed to bring to the emergency HOA session. Karen wouldn't be able to brush off a city report. As Tuesday night approached, tension hummed in the air. I arrived at the community center with Meredith. The building was abuzz with chatter. A few folks gave me understanding nods, others avoided eye contact. Karen, of course, presided at the front of the room, wearing a crisp blazer and that trademark fixed smile. An older woman named Beverly, who chaired the meeting, called everyone to order. "We're here to discuss the community playground installed on Mr. and Mrs. Davis's property. The city inspector's preliminary findings have been shared with the board. Now, Karen has requested we address these findings." Karen stood, clearing her throat. "Thank you, Beverly. First, let me say that I only had the best intentions for our neighborhood. I believed this playground would foster unity and provide a safe space for children. While I may not have completed every detail of the formal process, I trust the board understands my intentions were pure." A few sympathetic murmurs sounded. Then Beverly asked me to speak. I laid out the evidence again. The city's initial report states this structure lacks permits, violates property rights, and could incur fines if not removed. I have ownership documents, which show the yard is strictly private property. Karen never approached me for permission. Beverly opened the floor for questions. One board member, a man named Ron, spoke up. Karen, did you really not get any written approval? We're hearing about no vote, no permit. That's not a small oversight. Karen's cheeks tinged pink. Well, I approached some of you informally. You all expressed interest. I assumed it was enough to move forward. Another board member shook her head. That's not how we do things. We have a process. You know this. Karen shot me a glare, then addressed the room. Look, I'm sorry for any confusion, but do we really want to tear down a valuable addition that could benefit so many families? Beverly tapped her gavel lightly. Karen, this is not about whether we want a playground. It's about respecting property lines and following due process. We can't just ignore municipal regulations. The debate continued, but it was clear the board was cornered. The city inspector's findings gave them no wiggle room. They risked legal ramifications if they endorsed Karen's rogue approach. In the end, Beverly read the official motion. We must vote on whether to support Karen's project or to deem it unauthorized and order its removal. Board members, please cast your votes. I held my breath. Karen seemed poised at the front, nerves clenched behind her forced smile. The board members voted one by one. When Beverly tallied the votes, the result was clear. The playground is unauthorized. We must remove the concrete. The HOA will not be held liable if Karen acted alone. We also recommend that the city fine any individual responsible for the violation. Karen's face went pale. She tried to sputter a defense, but Beverly banged the gavel. The matter was settled. A hush fell over the room, then neighbors began to chatter in small groups, some relieved, others uneasy. Sensing her humiliation, Karen made a quick exit, shoulders stiff. I watched her go, a swirl of conflicting emotions in my gut. Triumph, relief, but also a strange sympathy at how thoroughly she'd destroyed her own credibility. The next few days were surreal. A contractor Karen had hired appeared, looking sheepish, to start jackhammering the fresh concrete. The neighborhood was treated to the ruckus of machinery, tearing apart what had been poured so recklessly just a couple of weeks earlier. Shards of cement piled up in wheelbarrows, and trucks hauled them away. Some neighbors offered apologetic smiles whenever I passed by, as though they felt partly responsible for letting Karen run amok. Others voiced relief that the backyard fiasco was ending. One older couple even approached me to say they'd initially believed Karen's claims about shared spaces, but were glad the truth came out before more damage was done. John stopped by to check on me. "Looks like you won," he said, surveying the partially dismantled slab. "I just wanted my yard back," I replied. "And to make sure everyone knows, we can't let one person bulldoze over property rights." He laughed, a sound tinged with relief. "Welcome to the real HOA politics. Now everyone knows you can't be pushed around." I knelt down to inspect the damage beneath the torn-up concrete. The lawn was ruined in that section, and the soil compacted. It would take time and effort to restore it. I felt a pang of frustration, but also acceptance. At least it was being removed, and Karen was footing the bill. So the board had informed me. Word spread that Karen was under investigation for failing to obtain permits, and she faced a hefty fine from the city. Some rumored she might have to step down from her position on the HOA board. A few claimed she'd been warned before about similar unapproved projects, and now the city had had enough. Meanwhile, Meredith and I tried to return to a sense of normalcy. We invited Lisa and Greg over one night for pizza and a movie. They admitted they were relieved the fiasco was ending. "I still can't believe she just poured concrete in your yard," Lisa marveled. "That's next-level audacity." Greg nodded. "I hope this sets a precedent. We can have community improvements without trampling on each other's rights." On Friday morning, I checked the backyard. The contractor had filled the last truck with the final scraps of debris, leaving behind a churned-up patch of earth. I stood there, imagining how we might replant grass or maybe put in a small herb garden. It felt good to have my space back, albeit scarred. An official letter from the city arrived in the mail later that day. It confirmed their findings. Unauthorized construction, no permits filed, violation of municipal code. It included a section naming Karen as the individual responsible. The letter also noted that any future attempts at similar construction would be subject to immediate fines. I couldn't help feeling a sense of closure. That weekend, a new hush settled over the neighborhood, as though everyone was taking a collective breath. Karen had gone noticeably quiet. No more flyers, no more forced community events. The only rumor was that she might have resigned from her leadership role or was about to be ousted at the next formal board meeting. Some folks speculated she'd do anything to avoid a lawsuit. Still, part of me expected one last burst of defiance from her. She struck me as the type who'd claw her way out of a losing situation. But day after day, there was nothing. It was almost eerie. One afternoon, I decided to knock on Graham's door again to see how things looked from his vantage point. He greeted me with a wry smile. "Saw the trucks hauling all that broken concrete away. Guess we can call that a job undone, huh?" I chuckled. "That's a nicer way of putting it than I would, but yeah, it's over." He nodded. "Karen always played fast and loose with the rules, but she's never gone quite that far. It's good you stood your ground. Might keep the next ambitious busybody in check." "Thanks, Graham. Honestly, I hope we can just move on now. I didn't move here for drama." He patted my shoulder. "Truth is, you did us all a favor. Some of us old-timers were tired of Karen's tactics. Maybe now we can have a more honest HOA." I left feeling a wave of relief. For the first time in weeks, the tension in my shoulders eased. Maybe I'd inadvertently helped the entire community by exposing Karen's overreach. On a crisp Monday morning, I stood in my backyard once again. My rightful backyard, free of concrete. The soil where the slab had been was still rough, but I'd spread new topsoil and grass seed. A sense of peace settled over me as I imagined the green returning in a few weeks. Meredith joined me, a cup of coffee in hand. "We can finally enjoy our yard again," she said softly, leaning against my shoulder. "I know," I replied, exhaling a grateful breath. "It's been a wild ride, but we made it through." We talked about turning this messy patch into something special, maybe a small flower garden or a neat vegetable patch for fresh produce. The possibilities felt exciting. No longer was our yard a battleground. It was a blank canvas for personal projects we'd dreamed about when we first bought the house. Later that week, a formal notice arrived from the HOA. It contained a brief apology, signed by Beverly and a few other board members, acknowledging the unauthorized actions taken by Karen. They reassured me, and presumably every neighbor who got the letter, that the HOA intended to adhere strictly to proper procedures going forward. Karen's name was noticeably absent from the board's list of active members. A sense of resolution washed over me. The letter indicated we wouldn't be subject to any fees or repercussions. The blame lay solely on Karen. There was also a promise of a future discussion about building a real playground, properly permitted and perhaps located on actual communal property near the neighborhood park. They even invited me to join a committee to explore the idea, an olive branch extended in good faith. I contemplated it. It would be ironic if, after all this, I helped build a legitimate playground in the right place with everyone's blessing, but it also felt like a chance to channel the frustration into something positive. Maybe that was the best way to heal the neighborhood rift Karen had caused, to prove that we could have improvements without trampling over individual rights. Greg and Lisa dropped by that evening, bringing their kids to see the yard's progress. Their youngest tottered over the loose soil, giggling at the idea of mud squishing underfoot. Lisa apologized again for not speaking up sooner. "We just weren't sure if we had the right to question Karen. She's been so pushy for years." I waved it off. It's water under the bridge. Honestly, I learned a lesson too. Sometimes you gotta stand your ground, even if it's uncomfortable. Greg nodded. Yeah, you set a precedent that one person can't hijack the entire neighborhood. Over time, the Karen incident, as it came to be called, morphed into a cautionary tale. People shared the story with new residents, advising them to read their HOA bylaws carefully. The neighborhood as a whole seemed more unified in ensuring that changes went through proper channels. I noticed fewer petty disputes at board meetings and more constructive discussions. A sense of mutual respect began to blossom in place of old resentments. Eventually, Karen's house went up for sale. She never came by to say goodbye, no parting words or attempts at reconciliation. I heard rumors that she planned to move to another neighborhood, maybe one with a less vigilant HOA. A small part of me hoped she'd learn not to trample on other people's property, but I wasn't holding my breath. Meanwhile, my backyard flourished. The grass grew back thicker and greener than before. Meredith and I planted a few rows of vegetables, a nod to self-sustainability. Every time I knelt down to tend the seedlings, I felt a surge of gratitude for our victory. We'd stuck to our guns, used official channels, refused to be intimidated, and in the end, we'd won back our space. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself reclining on a new patio chair, iced tea in hand, admiring the quiet. The air was warm and the distant sound of kids laughing drifted from somewhere else in the neighborhood, likely the park. I smiled, thinking about how nice it was that they had a dedicated area to play, far from any infringement on private property. Maybe the HOA would eventually build a playground the right way. And I'd be part of it. After all, I believed in real community, not forced improvements at someone else's expense. Meredith stepped out to join me, handing me a second glass of iced tea. "You did it," she said, nodding at the yard. "You beat Karen and her unstoppable thirst for control." I chuckled. "We did it!" "Couldn't have done it without your support." She took a seat next to me. "Think we'll ever hear from her again?" "Who knows," I replied with a shrug, "but if we do, we know what to do now. Stand up for what's right." Meredith raised her glass in a mock toast to standing up for what's right. I clinked my glass against hers, soaking in the peace of our hard-won victory. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. This was our home, our yard. We'd claimed it back from the grip of someone who thought they could stomp all over our rights. And in that triumph, I found a new confidence, not just in dealing with HOAs or neighborhood bullies, but in facing whatever challenge might come next. Sometimes, the most important lesson is that you can't always avoid conflict, but when it arrives, you have to stand your ground. You have to be willing to push back with evidence, logic, and a calm resolve. Karen taught me that. And for that lesson, at least, I was oddly grateful. Our backyard, once invaded and overshadowed by her brazen vision, was now a testament to the power of owning your space, literally and figuratively. I leaned back, feeling the gentle warmth of the setting sun, content in the knowledge that peace was finally ours. The memory of that concrete slab might never fully fade, but it no longer represented defeat. It stood for a battle won with careful persistence. In a strange way, it even strengthened the sense of community. Neighbors realized we should keep each other informed, stand up for one another's rights, and remain vigilant about the rules. Real unity, after all, thrives on mutual respect. A light breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and I took a final sip of my iced tea. "This is the life," I murmured, letting the last rays of sunlight glow on my face. I heard Meredith hum in agreement beside me, and in that quiet moment, I let myself believe that the days of waking up to horrifying surprises in my backyard were long gone, replaced by the promise of open, honest cooperation. No matter where Karen went or what stunts she might pull in the future, I understood now that I and anyone else she tried to bulldoze held a powerful advantage. The right to say no, backed by the rule of law and the unwavering belief in standing up for what's yours. That would be enough. And as I closed my eyes, the final threads of tension eased from my body, leaving behind only the contentment of a rightful victory.